Welcome to Casual Friday. So I'm going to update you on my current knitting projects, tell you about my second day volunteering at the fair, this time at the Weavers Guild booth where I was demonstrating spinning. And then I'm going to answer a couple of questions that I've had in the Rocks group, kind of about my knitting past. One is some questions about the old Ask a Knitter column that I used to write. And the other is about the skill set that changed it all for me. That was the game changer for me. So if you'd like to jump around in the video, I'll have links down in the description that'll kind of help you jump from topic to topic if you would like to do that. So let's get started. Last week I had demonstrated in the Minnesota Knitters Guild demonstration booth on the first day of the fair. But this past Tuesday, I returned to the fair to do a demonstration of spinning at the Weavers Guild's booth. Now, the Weavers Guild, since the 1950s, I believe, has been at the fair demonstrating all day, every day. There was a period of time when creative activities had gotten really popular and they needed room for displaying things. And so they had limited the number of demonstrations that were going on at the fair. But the Weavers Guild has always remained at the fair every day, 12 hours a day, 12 days of the fair. And so the Weavers Guild has 3 volunteers who are there at a time, and you have a 4-hour block of time that you are demonstrating whatever it is that you have signed up for. Now, the Weavers Guild does weaving, dyeing, and spinning. So typically they have somebody spinning, and they have a floor loom there that they have all a warp set up, and there's certain colors they're supposed to use for that, for the particular year. They pick some colors, and so the table loom is always in operation. And then the third spot, it seems to be the one that kind of rotates around. They could have what they call an off loom weaver. So something that's not on a big loom, but it's something else. And they also have a few other demonstrations. They might have dyeing. I don't remember all the different categories because I was specifically focused on signing up to be a spinner. So I had the option of bringing my own wheel, and I really did think about it. But there were going to be some logistics issues with that in terms of getting to the fair with the loom, and then what do I do when my shift is over? I really wasn't sure about it. And as it turned out, the day that I had to be at the fair on Tuesday, it was very cold and it was raining. So I would have had to bring my spinning wheel, walk through the entire fairgrounds, and from my car where I parked it to the shuttle bus, all of that I would have had, even though it would have been in a case, it would have been getting wet, and I'm really happy I didn't do that. They had 2 different wheels available to spin on at the demonstration booth. One was a Louette, and that was the type that I had used in my very first spinning class when we got a rental wheel that we could take home with us from the Weavers Guild. And then the other one was an Ashford Traditional, which is the type of spinning wheel you think if you had to visualize what does a spinning wheel look like. It's more horizontal. It has a wheel over to one side, and then the flyer and bobbin assembly are over to the left, whereas my Lendrum and a lot of other types of more modern wheels are more stacked more vertically and take up less floor space. I was familiar with the Louette because I had practice with that in my spinning class, and so I thought I'm going to see if I can figure out the Ashford Traditional on my own and actually get it to work and be able to spin on it. So one of the things is we had to bring our own fiber. I had no idea how much fiber I would need in a 4-hour demonstration block. So just like when I pack on a trip with my knitting, maybe I'll just bring a little bit more. Maybe I'll bring this too. It's a huge bag of fiber that I took with me. And so I had plenty. And it was really fun, and it was a interesting experience. I have some ideas for what I would do differently next year, because they didn't really tell you what you needed to do in a spinning demonstration. You were allowed to use the spinning wheels, you could use a spindle, you could do whatever. And you could bring samples of your work. So I brought the yarn that I had made, my very first yarn that I had made, that I used, had done on a spindle. It was very thick and thin. So I brought that, and then I brought a sample, the leftover sample of the yarn that was really the first project where I purchased the fiber, and I spun a yarn that I actually wanted to knit with, and then the project that I knitted with it. And I let people know I've only been spinning for a few months. This was my first attempt. Here's my third attempt, and I was able to knit something that was, a reasonable thing that could be worn. So that was fun. What was really interesting was contrasting the people who came to the demonstrations and who asked questions in the hand knitting booth versus the spinning booth. So at the hand knitting, you would get couples showing up, you'd get women who would come up, and we would always ask, are you a knitter? And if they weren't, do you want to learn how to knit? And if they said yes, or they've been thinking about it, we would tell them, we would show them how to do it, and we would talk to them about resources where they could learn more. And we, of course, would tell them about the guild. If they came up to us and they already knew how to knit, then we would tell them all about the guild, and we would invite them to next month's meeting, where people who had entered things into the fair would be bringing them for sort of show and tell, and really encouraging that, and telling them all about the things the guild could offer. Well, a number of people who would stop at the Knitters Guild booth were older gentlemen. Often they would just plop themselves down on the bench, because there's a bench in front of us. And the Minnesota State Fair is huge. It covers a lot of acres, and it's an exhausting day of walking regardless of what your age is. And so for older, and benches are at a premium often. The more crowded it is, the harder it is to find a bench anywhere to sit down just to eat, or just to take a load off your feet, anything. So we have an empty bench in front of the booth, and so you'd get these older gentlemen would just sit down kind of like that, and then we'd ask them, are you a knitter? Oh, no. And then say, well, do you want to learn? No. And so, would you just want to watch? Yes. And typically what it was, they just wanted to sit down and rest while, their wife or their family, whoever they were with, were wandering around looking at all of the displays of creative activities. And that was fine. For the spinners, for the Weavers Guild booth, it was different. I would get couples would sit down and watch, or families would sit down and watch. But the older gentlemen weren't just sitting down and kind of relaxing. I would look up from what I was doing to see if I could see if anybody was showing any interest and might have any questions. I would look up, and often these men would be, if they were still seated, they would be just staring at the spinning wheel, watching it. And I might say something like, it's mesmerizing, isn't it? Or, do you have any questions? But often they didn't stay sitting for long. I would look up, and there they would be standing against there's kind of a counter between the demonstration area and where the people can watch, because you can lay samples and things on there. And they'd be leaned up against the counter, looking down, and they would be asking all kinds of questions about how it worked, and they'd be watching. There's one man who's like, there seems to be some sort of magic going on in your hands, because I would have, the big fluffy fiber, and then there would be this thin strand of yarn that was getting wound onto the wheel. And so they're trying to figure out how it works. And the Ashford Traditional, the drive band for that. So there's the big wheel, and then there's the bobbin and the flyer have a little wheel, and so there's a band that connects the two of them. It's like a pulley system. So every time the big wheel goes around, then the bobbin or the flyer goes around 6, 8, 10 times revolves 6 or 8 times more often than the big wheel does. And so this drive band causes it to go around. But on the Ashford traditional, the drive band is really just a couple of pieces of string. And so that was what was throwing people. They're like, is the yarn that I'm making going around that big thing? Or they were trying to figure out what's going on. But these men were very interested. And so I would explain to them, what's going on with the twisting of the fiber and how the bobbin and flyer were spinning but not winding anything on. And just what was happening was just the twist was occurring in the yarn that they could see between the spinning wheel and my hands. And then as I fed it, as I allowed it to feed onto the bobbin would slow down and the flyer would continue to spin. So they're like, oh, it's like a motor, because it's a machine. So it's really interesting. And then there would be a couple of men who came by who were woodworkers and were telling me about their woodworking projects, and because the creative activities also includes woodworking. So they were really fascinated with it as a piece of furniture and how it works and the fact that it's a wooden machine. So really interested about it. As one man told me all about these fireboxes that he was making for a customer of his, and how people don't appreciate how much sort of the labor and the time and materials that goes into making something handmade. But he had this customer who really appreciated it, and so we were talking about that. And then another man came by and said that he had made his own spinning wheel years ago. He had some plans, and he made a spinning wheel, and he took a class, and everyone was talking about how old their spinning wheels were, and people had some antiques that their great grandmothers had brought from Norway. And he's like, well, my spinning wheel is 8 hours old. I just finished putting the varnish on it. And he said, unfortunately, it didn't spin very well. But he came back later and he was asking me more questions. So that I thought was really interesting. The women who were coming by were mostly interested in what the fiber was that I was spinning. And after a while, I realized what was going on. The previous night on the news, local news, because the TV and radio stations are all at the fair all day, every day. So when they do the evening news, they're at the fair, and they're usually talking about things that are going on at the fair. So one of the channels had done a piece on a woman in the education building who was spinning wolf fur. And so this one woman said, oh, I saw you on TV last night. I'm like, no, you didn't. It wasn't on TV. Oh, no, I even look, it had to be you. Are you spinning wolf fur? And I'm like, no. So then we found out it was the education building, and the people say, oh, are you whatever this woman's name is? I'm like, nope. And people say, are you spinning wolf fur? So the women, when they catch eye of me, they remembered seeing me and thought that I was that woman. But the men were interested in the mechanics of the spinning wheel. So I did bring a spindle with me, but I didn't have it like hooked up, and I wasn't demonstrating on that. I think next year that in addition to spinning on the spinning wheel, I'm going to have a spindle set up so that people can understand and maybe even try it themselves. Something that they can do hands-on, because there's not really a way for them to come in and then sit down behind the wheel and try it. At least I wasn't comfortable teaching them how to do that, because I barely know how to spin myself. But maybe by next year, I'll be able to do that. So that was my part 2 of my adventures at the fair. Oh, I wanted to say, a lot of you commented on the video that I posted at the end of last week's video about the fair, and I showed all of the knitting, and several people asked or were convinced that some of those sweaters were machine knit, and they were not. That was the hand knitting competition. There is a machine knitting competition, which is separate. There's crochet, there's machine knitting, there's baby garments that might be crocheted or knitted but are outside of the knitting competition. There's a senior citizens competition that includes a variety of different crafts, including knitting. But what I showed you was the hand knitting, the cases of hand knitting. None of that was machine knit, and it's some of the work. It really is incredible. And that's what's hard to understand when you tell people about the knitting at the Minnesota State Fair and the level of competition that that exists there, which is what makes it so much fun for me anyway to go through and look at. So I want to update you on my knitting projects. When I was at the fair last week and at the demonstration book, I started a booth. I started a sock project because I wanted something that just I didn't have to think about. I didn't want to take the stranded color work, that little baby sweater I'm knitting with the sheep on. I didn't want to take that. So I started a sock, and socks for me are just so easy. I really don't have to think about them, especially if I'm using the same yarn and the same needle, you know, the same type of yarn that I've used before and the same needles, and I'm knitting for the same person. I can just look at a previous project and I can take note of how many stitches I cast on, what needles I used. And that's what I do. So this is the sock I'm currently working on. It's for my brother. This is I spent the leg trying to figure out, well, what kind of heel I'm going to do this time. I think I'm going to do, well, I know I'm going to do a peasant heel for him. And I'm probably about half the way through the foot. And once I get to the toes, I'll decide if I have enough yarn to use this yarn, the same yarn for the heels and the toes. If not, I have some contrast yarn in this kind of olive green color. It's not quite the same olive green, but again, I have a little trouble with, especially with olive greens, so I might do part of the heel and then ask my husband if it goes well enough or not, because I can't tell. I don't think it quite matches well enough, but sometimes I can't gauge that. So that's what I'm working on here. I did make one other thing in one evening. I think it was January, February, my daughter, who goes to college in Boston, she's been reading a lot. She bought herself a little Kindle, and she wanted a little, like a little sock for it to protect the screen. And so she thought, well, maybe she could knit something for it. So she asked me what yarn and needles to get. And so she was texting me from the yarn shop, and I was telling her, and then she realized that she was casting on, she didn't actually know how to purl. She'd only knit before. So I made a little video that just for her to show her how to purl. And she apparently cast on over a period of weeks 15 different times and then would get stuck. And she didn't know how to fix things because there was nobody there saying, oh no. She's like, if things fell off the needle, I didn't know what to do. So it's been stuck in the bottom of her closet all summer. She's been home all summer. I asked her about it a few times. It's like, do you want me to get you going on it again? Do you want me to just do it for you? I'm happy to get you going on it because I think once you get going, it would be fine. And she said, oh, no. So she was going to leave Wednesday morning. So Tuesday night, I'd been at the fair in the morning. I was really tired. And I said something about it. And I said, well, just go get it. Let me see it. Like, go get it. So she went and she got it and she brought it down. And she did a beautiful job of what she had. She did have some things mixed up, like the needles. Something had gotten twisted around, but it was very easy to fix. I fixed it and I just started working on it. And I said, give me your Kindle because I don't know how long it needs to be. And so as a family, we were watching some YouTube videos together, and that was helping me speed along. And she needed to go leave the house to see a friend of hers and say goodbye. And so I just finished it. It probably took me an hour and a half, something like that. It didn't take me very long. So I finished it. I took it upstairs, put her Kindle in it, set it on her bed. And in the morning, she's like, I can't believe you did that in 1 hour. I spent so many weeks trying to get started. And I said, that's just, you didn't have anybody sitting next to you. So that's what I did. It's the easiest thing in the world. I did not use a pattern. I just used my gauge and measurements of the Kindle and knit it. I did do, right before I did the graft at the bottom, I did a round where I decreased at the edges so that it would go in a little bit, form little corners, because the Kindle is kind of got a rounded corner. So I just wanted it to fit like that a little bit. It's very easy. It was one of those very relaxing knitting. I didn't have to think at all, really, and which was good because I was tired. Okay, so I had some questions. There's a thread in my Rocks group where, well, in the Rocks group, I've mentioned this before, you can always ask me a question. You can start a new topic, especially if it's about a technique or if it's about a particular project that you're stuck on. You should start a new topic and ask those questions there. But if you're just wondering questions about me that are, or about knitting in general that isn't like a specific technique, there is a thread on there called Ask Me Anything for Casual Fridays. And several people have asked questions in there. So one of the first questions somebody asked was about the old Ask a Knitter column. And the questions they wanted to know was how did I come to write that column? What were my qualifications? Did anybody get mad at me for the advice I gave them? A bunch of other things like that. So I thought I'd tell you what that Ask a Knitter column was, because you can still read those old columns if you want. They're on my Rocks group. There are little tabs. When you're on the page of the Rocks group in Ravelry, there's little tabs at the top of the screen, and one of them says Pages. And if you click on that tab, then I have 4 pages set up. One of them is my 2017 videos. One is my 2018 videos. One is links to all my Internet Weave articles for the various magazines I write for. And the fourth one is a link to all those old Ask a Knitter columns. So what was Ask a Knitter? Well, Ask a Knitter was a column within the Ravelry newsletter. Ravelry had a newsletter called This Week in Ravelry that was started by volunteers. Casey, who's the programmer for Ravelry, provided the tools to allow Ravelers to create a newsletter, and they had different columns. There was an advice column. It wasn't a knitting advice; it was just sort of a life advice column. There were things like funny things that people said, or funny threads that occurred around Ravelry. There was a column called the Tip Jar, which was a compilation of all the best knitting and crocheting tips that had been seen on Ravelry in the previous week. And then there were other things too, but this was all driven by Ravelers, and it was kind of driven by Ravelers. It started in January of, I think, 2008. So Ravelry had started the previous year, and it was growing fast enough that there were a lot of new features that were going on. There were a lot of new groups that were starting. There's just a lot going on, and it would be hard to keep track of everything that was going on. It's impossible now, but at the time you could kind of keep track of it. And the number of people that were on Ravelry at the time was relatively small. I joined in October of 2007. So toward the end of 2007, and I was like the 17,000 something person to be on Ravelry. So it was a smaller community, and so there was a sense of, let's create a newsletter so we can keep each other updated. So it went so that was the beginning of 2008, and I read it. I read not all parts of it, but I read it every week. And then in, I think, like June or July of 2009, there was a group for the people who ran This Week in Ravelry, all the volunteer editors and all that kind of stuff. And there was a group in there, and they said, well, the person doing the tip jar isn't doing it anymore, but it was really popular, and should we do like a posting for that? How are we going to fill that void? Because people really liked the tip jar. And so somebody in that thread just earburned me so that I would see it. And I went and I looked, and they said, are you interested in doing that? And I said, no, not really. I'm more interested in writing tips and techniques than I would be in compiling the tips of other people. So I said, it's not something I'm interested in. So they said, well, can you ask anybody in your group? So I posted in the Rocks group. I said, and if anybody's interested in doing this compilation. Well, the thread in the This Week in Ravelry group continued on, and someone said, well, what about, it doesn't have to be the tip jar. There had been talk about having an ask the expert or ask a knitter type of column in the past. Maybe it's time to do that instead. And they were asking me, is that something you'd be interested in? I'm like, well, that I would be interested in. I'm like, but how would it even work? I didn't have any. I'd never thought about it. I had no idea. And so they were saying, oh, well, you could have maybe a couple of different questions that you answer. The questions could come from private messages. They could come from things that you've seen in the forums. It's really your own thing. You can do whatever you want. So I thought about it, and I thought, oh, yeah, I might want to do that. So that's how it happened. It was like, do you want to do this? No. Well, what about this other thing? Oh, okay. That's how it worked. But the reason that I was ear burned was because at the time, I was pretty visible on Ravelry. As I mentioned, it was a smaller community. I was answering a lot of questions in the Techniques forum, and I still go on the Techniques forum every day. And I answer questions pretty regularly, but there are so many people on Ravelry and so many questions that come through that by the time I get to them, a lot of times they've already been answered. So I just don't answer as many questions as I used to. But that's how my name came up as a possible person who might be interested in doing that. But to be fair to me, I have a degree in communications, specifically in writing. I worked as a technical writer. I did technical support for computers and networking. I taught computer classes, and I taught fiction classes, and did workshops and stuff. So I was answering a lot of questions online in writing. So it wasn't like I didn't, and I was teaching at my local yarn shop by that time as well. So I totally had the background, but it wasn't like there was a job posting and me submitting a resume. It just happened, and that's it. So part of the question was, whatever happened to the Ask a Knitter column? Why did it end? And the answer to that is that This Week in Ravelry ceased production. So as I mentioned, this was all volunteer generated material. So whoever the person was who had been the sort of chief editor of This Week in Ravelry, if I'm remembering correctly, I think she was in graduate school and she just didn't have time anymore. By the time I came on board with my Ask a Knitter column, This Week in Ravelry was every other week. And so I started in 2009, and for a full year, I was doing the column every other week. And then from about September or so of 2010 to October of 2011, there were only 4 issues that came out. There was one in September, one in January, one in March, one in May, and then there was the very final one in October of 2011. So it had just run its course, and they kept links to This Week in Ravelry and the Ask a Knitter columns on the right side of the home page for quite a long time. And Casey promised that the information that was contained in there would continue to be there. So that's why I've been able to continue linking to the original articles. But now, instead, they had Casey, Mary Heather, and Sarah, who all work paid employees of Ravelry, rotate through doing blog postings that occur on the front page of Ravelry. So it's just sort of the natural course of how things went. There was nothing, I didn't quit or anything. It stopped, and that was it. Oh, the question about did anybody get mad at me for the advice I gave them? And not that I recall. Even on videos, I do get some negative comments on videos sometimes. Most of the time, if people are listening to what I'm saying, what they'll hear me say is there are multiple ways of getting to the same endpoint. This is one way. There are advantages and there are disadvantages. Here are the situations in which this technique might work well for you, that you should swatch it and try it out and see if it's something that you can use now, or maybe it's something that you wouldn't want to use all the time, but you could see use in using that technique in a specific situations. So I don't tend to be a commandant when it comes to giving out knitting advice, and I'm usually, pretty clear about how and why and when you might want to use it, and acknowledging that every knitter is different and may not want to use that technique, which is completely fine with me. So I think for all those reasons, I don't tend to get, and I tend to only answer questions that I'm pretty confident that I have the answer to, and that I ask myself a lot of questions first about how this technique could be used. So I try to challenge myself about what I'm explaining before anybody else could. So I have really been thinking about this for a while, because this question, I was going to answer this question a few weeks ago, and just because of the length of the Casual Friday videos, it just I never quite thought that I had really had room for it. But I have been thinking about this a long time, and it's taken me a while to really decide what that one skill is. So I started off knowing that level 1 of the Master Hand Knitting program provided me with a couple of skills or pieces of information that I had never really thought about before. And that was gauge and mirrored increases and decreases. So up until that point, when I started the Master Hand Knitting program, pretty much any pattern that I ever used had been produced by probably one of a few publishers. So you've got the yarn companies producing patterns, you've got magazines publishing patterns, and then you've got book publishers that focus on things like crafts that are producing knitting patterns. So most knitting patterns came from these few commercial sources, and they really standardized things like gauge and they standardized needle size for gauge. So I have a friend, Joan Schroeder, who is a phenomenal knitter and teacher and designer, and she used to design for various knitting magazines, and she would always, when she sent the pattern, she'd tell them what needle size she had used to get that gauge, and they would always change it in the pattern because Joan's slightly loose, a slightly loose knitter, and so she tended to use a smaller needle size than what the standard would be for producing that gauge. So as a new knitter getting patterns, I'd buy a pattern, and more often than not, I would buy the yarn that they called for because I was buying a pattern produced by the yarn company. And so, the shop that I bought the pattern also sells the yarn, so I'll get whatever color I want in that yarn. And then it would tell me what needles to use, and I'd buy those needles. And I always got the gauge. I would measure my things as I knit, because I did understand that was important to get the right gauge, but I always got the right gauge with the needles that they told me to use. So I was really an on-gauge knitter. Now, if I'd been a little bit loose or a little bit tight, I probably would have figured out at some point that, I'm always too big or I'm always too small. I need to change. I always need to go down a needle size, or I always need to go down 2 needle sizes or up a needle size, whatever. I would have learned that. But about the time that I started the Master Hand Knitting program, shortly thereafter, maybe within a couple of years, the independent designer, the ability for independent designers to produce and sell designs online became easier. And then once Ravelry allowed independent designers to sell their patterns, it became a piece of cake. And it's the independent designers I am one of them. So I am not dissing independent designers. I'm just explaining the change. So an independent designer that produces their own patterns is going to list the needle size that they use to get gauge in the pattern. So this makes it a little bit more challenging for a new knitter to be able to understand what needle size they're going to need, because they don't necessarily have the experience, but they may learn early on about doing gauge swatching, or they may decide I never get gauge, so I'm just going to knit shawls, which is too bad. So the Master Hand Knitting program really made me aware of gauge and how different stitch patterns will produce a different gauge when the exact same yarn, down to the exact same dye lot, use the exact same yarn, same needles, and you will get different gauges for different stitch patterns. You'll get different ones for ribbing and garter stitch and seed stitch and stockinette. And so that it pointed out to me how that worked. It showed me how to do a gauge swatch, how to measure one, how to calculate the gauge. I learned that. And then the swatches that we were doing for the Master Hand Knitting program were on basic techniques. So we'd have certain increases and certain decreases to use in a particular swatch, and they would mirror them. So they would tell you to use an SSK at the right edge, 3 stitches in, and a knit 2 together, 3 stitches in at the left edge, so that you would get this thing that tapered, and they would ask you questions, forcing you to make observations about what these decreases were doing, how they were leaning. I never even noticed the lean, like directly. I knew that things looked different, but I didn't know what I was looking at. So that level 1 taught me that certain decreases lean certain way and certain increases do too, and that you can choose how you want to mirror them, but they showed me the importance of mirroring. So those 2 topics were really important to me. And then, so that was like early 2005. Then in late 2005, I joined a Yahoo group that had a knit along. This is before Ravelry. So the way you interacted with other knitters tended to be in email groups. And it was a Follow the Leader Aran knit along. So all of the stitch patterns for the Aran sweater had been selected. So you didn't have to do that aspect of the design. And we were all knitting top down, but we were taught how to measure, what to measure, where to measure, and then how to make decisions about the kind of neckline we wanted, whether you wanted a cardigan or a pullover, how to figure out what sleeve depth we want, and how much ease we wanted. All of those kinds of concepts I learned in the Follow the Leader Aran knit along. It was a really great pattern for, or really great knit along for bridging between being a slave to patterns and learning how to design. So those things in that year allowed me then to design a shrug, a very simple shrug for my younger daughter. She kind of decided, she went to a store, I want a shrug like that, but with a stitch pattern that's like that. And we had some yarn, and I was able to I learned how to measure her, and I understood how to use the decreases to do shaping for the armholes. And I built all these skills together that allowed me to design. So I was thinking, well, there isn't a single skill really. It's that combination of things that really changed. It was that year of knitting really changed how I knit. But I was thinking about this a little bit more, and really what it was, just reading through the materials for level 1 of the Master Hand Knitting program, being asked questions and being told I needed to look them up in reference books, even though I knew the answer. That was the skill that was the game changer. That it was learning to think about knitting in a different way, learning how to observe what was going on, learning how to make choices, and then learning how to voice an opinion about my choices. Like, why am I doing that? Not just, well, this is the way I always did it. Why, other than habit, why would you choose that? If you know that you can choose this or that, why do you prefer that? And, sometimes I didn't prefer it. Like with the long tail cast on, I didn't like the purl bumps on the right side of the work. It was a revelation to me that I could control the right side and wrong side of my cast on, and what I wanted to show, which edge I wanted to be public. That was a revelation to me. So there wasn't any technique. There was one technique, the jogless jog for stripes. There weren't any techniques in level 1 that I hadn't done before. But they were all techniques I had done because someone had told me to do them at a specific place in a specific row. It wasn't because I chose to do those techniques or knew why I was using those techniques. Like I knew an SSK or an SKP decrease, which is a left-leaning decrease. I knew that that was a decrease and that I was reducing my number of stitches. I did not recognize that it was left-leaning while a knit two together was right-leaning, and that if I used one on one side of a V-neck, then I should use the other on the other side of the V-neck in order for it to look symmetrical. That was the game changer, was being shown how to think about knitting differently and how I could learn more about knitting, how I could solve problems, how I could ask myself questions, how I could get the answers either myself or figure out what the question was I needed. You know, what is this problem I'm trying to solve, and what are some solutions, and where can I find the answers? And swatching. So that was the other thing. Is learning the value of swatching, and that is as informative. It's not, for many people, it's not the fun part. It's not the project. But for me, once I learned how to learn about knitting, that became just as much fun for me as actually applying those techniques and skills in a project. So I swatch probably every day. I probably swatch way more often than I'm actually working on a project because I'm wanting to figure something out. And that's something that I enjoy. It's not something everybody else enjoys, but it's something that I enjoy and I get a lot out of. I have one more thing, and this is a question for all of you. My Technique Tuesday video this week was on fixing yarn over mistakes. So if you forget to do a yarn over, or you get an extra yarn over in a project that you didn't intend, or you placed it in the wrong place, how do you fix those types of things? So these are important skills for lace knitters, not just for lace knitters, but especially for lace knitters. So my question for those of you who are maybe novice lace knitters, what are some of the problems that you have with lace that you don't know how to fix or resolve? Like, so what are some situations that you've run into where you've made a mistake and you didn't know how to fix it, and it would be something that would be a mistake in the current row or previous row, not something where you're going to ladder down 20 rows and have some kind of complicated fix. That's a more advanced skill. Just thinking about novice lace knitters and the kinds of challenges that maybe you have had in your lace knitting. And I'd love to hear about them. You can either leave them down in the comments below or over in my Ravelry group, Rocks. So that's my question for you guys this week. And that wraps it up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.